The dust rose in thin clouds beneath Thomas Walker's worn boots as he walked the main street of Dry Creek, a town so small it barely warranted a name on any map. The year was 1893, and the American West still carried the scars of conquest, of broken treaties, and of people pushed to the very edges of survival. Thomas himself was one of those people, though his skin was pale and weathered rather than bronze. His jacket hung loose on his frame, patched in 3 places with fabric that didn't quite match. His hands, rough as tree bark from years of coaxing stubborn crops from stubborn soil, clutched a single coin in his pocket, $1 silver. It was all that remained of his last harvest sale, and he had walked 6 miles into town to buy flour for his family. The sun beat down without mercy, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the dirt road. Thomas wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dust across his brow. He passed the general store, the saloon with its perpetual smell of whiskey and tobacco, the livery stable where old man Henderson was shoeing a horse. Normal sounds, normal sights. Just another day in a town where nothing ever seemed to change. But then Thomas saw her. She was kneeling in the narrow alley between the bank and the telegraph office, her body curled in on itself like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Her clothing was a patchwork of traditional Apache dress and cast-off fabric, torn and stained beyond recognition. Her long black hair, which might have once been beautiful, hung in tangled ropes around her face. But it was her eyes that stopped Thomas in his tracks. Even from a distance, even through the dirt and desperation, those eyes held something that made his chest tighten. She was crying. Thomas had seen poverty before. He lived it every day. He had seen hunger in the faces of his own children when the crops failed. But this was different. This was a kind of brokenness that went deeper than empty bellies or threadbare clothes. This was the look of someone who had been told, over and over, that her life held no value. As Thomas drew closer, the woman's head lifted. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them, something wordless and profound. Then her gaze dropped to the ground, and her shoulders began to shake. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the town. "Please, just leave me. Don't waste anything on me. I'm not worth it." The words were spoken in broken English, each syllable weighted with shame and exhaustion. Her hands pressed against the dirt as if she wanted to disappear into it, to become invisible, to simply cease being a burden to anyone. Thomas stood there, his own hand still wrapped around that $1 in his pocket. He should keep walking. He knew that. His wife Mary was waiting at home with their 3 children. Little Sarah had been coughing for a week. His son Jacob needed new shoes before winter. The flour he was supposed to buy would stretch across 2 weeks if they were careful. $1 could mean the difference between his family eating or going hungry. He looked at the woman again, really looked at her. Beneath the grime and despair, she couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother, definitely someone's child, once upon a time, before the world had taught her that her existence was something to apologize for. Around them, the town continued its lazy afternoon rhythm. A few people had noticed Thomas standing there, looking down at the Apache woman. Mrs. Plazy afternoon rhythm. Henderson from the boarding house crossed to the other side of the street, her nose wrinkled in distaste. 2 ranch hands leaned against the saloon's porch railing, one of them saying something that made the other laugh. No one else stopped. No one else even paused. Thomas pulled his hand from his pocket. The $1 caught the sunlight, glinting bright and clean against his calloused palm. He looked at it for a long moment, thinking of Mary, of the children, of the long walk home he would have to make empty-handed. Then he looked back at the woman kneeling in the dirt. The town of Dry Creek had been built on the ruins of something else. 15 years earlier, this land had belonged to the Apache people, had been traversed by their hunting parties and blessed by their ceremonies. Then came the miners, the ranchers, the farmers like Thomas himself. The Apache had been driven out, pushed onto reservations, or scattered to the 4 winds. Some, like this woman, had simply fallen through the cracks entirely, belonging nowhere, wanted by no one. Thomas had never thought much about it before. He had his own survival to worry about, his own family to feed. But standing here now, looking at this woman, who was quite literally begging him not to show her kindness. Something shifted inside his chest. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who had died when he was young, hungry and alone in a tenement in New York before they'd moved west. Maybe it was the thought of his daughter Sarah and what he would want someone to do if she were ever in such desperate circumstances. Maybe it was simply that for once in his hard, poor, struggling life, he could do something that mattered. He knelt down, his knees creaking with the effort, until he was level with the woman. Up close, he could see the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her collarbone stood out sharp against her skin. He could smell the sour scent of someone who hadn't had access to clean water in days. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground, refusing to meet his. "Ma'am," Thomas said softly, using the same gentle tone he used with frightened animals. "I'd like you to have this." He held out the silver dollar. The woman's eyes flicked up, wide with shock. She stared at the coin, then at Thomas's face, then back at the coin. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. When words finally came, they tumbled out in a desperate rush. "No, no, you don't understand. You can't. You need that money. Look at you. You're poor too. I can see it. Please, don't be foolish. I'm nothing. I'm nobody. Just an Apache. Just trash that nobody wanted. Don't throw away what little you have on trash." Each word seemed to cost her something. Tears tracked through the dirt on her cheeks. Her whole body trembled with the effort of refusing help, of maintaining the lesson that life had beaten into her that she deserved nothing, that asking for anything was wrong, that her very existence was an imposition. Thomas felt something break open inside him. Not pity. Something harder and cleaner than pity. Something like recognition. "You're not trash," he said, and his voice carried a firmness that surprised even himself. "You're a person. You're hurting. And I have something that might help, even if it's just a little. I'd be grateful if you'd take it." He pressed the coin into her hand. Her fingers, thin and trembling, closed around it automatically, as if her body didn't quite believe what her mind was processing. The silver felt cool and smooth against her palm, so at odds with everything rough and painful in her world. For a moment, neither of them moved. They stayed there, kneeling in the dirt of that narrow alley, two people at the very bottom of society's ladder, connected by a single act of impossible kindness. Then the woman's face crumpled entirely. She bent forward, clutching the coin to her chest, and began to sob. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. It was the sound of something breaking, or perhaps of something sealed tight finally cracking open. Thomas wanted to comfort her somehow, but didn't know how. Instead, he simply stayed there, a steady presence, until her crying began to slow. When she finally looked up at him again, her eyes held something different. Still pain, yes, still disbelief, but also something that might have been the faintest ember of hope. "Why?" she whispered. Thomas thought about that question. Why had he given away the only money he had? Why had he just guaranteed that his family would go hungry? Why had he chosen a complete stranger, and an Apache woman at that, when his whole town would call him a fool? "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. It was a simple answer, maybe too simple, but it was true. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting again. Behind him, he could hear whispers starting to spread. Mrs. Henderson was talking to the ranch hands now, all of them staring. Thomas could imagine what they were saying, could imagine the story that would be told about Thomas Walker, the fool who gave his last dollar to a worthless Apache. Let them talk. He had made his choice. "What's your name?" he asked the woman. She looked up at him, still clutching the coin. For a long moment, she didn't answer, as if she had forgotten she had a name, as if names were luxuries for people who mattered. "Sarah," she said finally, and then added something in Apache, words that flowed like water, musical and complex. "But they call me Sarah. Sarah Blackfeather. It's what the missionary school called me." Thomas felt a strange jolt at hearing his own daughter's name. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe it meant nothing, but it felt significant somehow. "I'm Thomas Walker," he said. "I have a farm about 6 miles west of here. If you ever need anything, if you're ever in trouble, you come find me. You hear?" Sarah Blackfeather stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language, as if kindness itself were something she no longer understood. Then she nodded, just once, a tiny motion of her head. Thomas tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect he would have given any lady on the street, and then he turned to begin the long walk home. His pocket was empty now. His hands were empty. He had nothing to show for his 6-mile journey into town except the certain knowledge that his wife would be upset and his children would still be hungry. But as he walked past the saloon, past the general store, past the curious and mocking eyes of his neighbors, Thomas Walker felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he had done something that mattered, something that might ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet see, something that might mean more than one more sack of flour or one more week of survival. Behind him, still kneeling in that alley, Sarah Blackfeather held the silver dollar up to the light. It was more money than she had seen in months. It was proof that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible after all. That somewhere in this harsh world, someone had seen her and decided she was worth something. She didn't know it yet, but that single moment would change both of their lives forever. The walk home felt longer than usual. Thomas's stomach was already starting to complain, reminding him that he had skipped breakfast to make the journey into town early. The sun beat down mercilessly, and dust coated his throat. Every step took him farther from town and deeper into the kind of regret that comes when a noble impulse collides with practical reality. What had he done? What had he been thinking? Mary was going to be furious. She would have every right to be. They had planned this together, budgeted down to the last cent. That silver dollar was supposed to buy flour, maybe some lard, possibly a small bit of salt if the prices were good. Instead, he had given it to a stranger. But every time doubt crept in, Thomas remembered those eyes, that brokenness, that desperate plea to be left alone because she didn't believe she deserved basic human kindness. And he knew, deep in his bones, that he had made the right choice, even if it was also the hard choice. The Walker farmhouse appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward evening. It wasn't much to look at, just 4 walls and a roof, a small barn out back, and fields that stretched away into the distance, currently brown and stubbled from the recent harvest. Home. Usually the sight of it brought Thomas a sense of peace, of refuge. Today it brought nothing but dread. Mary was in the yard, hanging laundry on the line. She saw him coming from a distance, and Thomas watched her face light up with anticipation. She would be expecting him to be carrying a sack of flour. Instead, his hands were empty. Her expression changed as he got closer. Confusion first, then concern, then something harder. "Thomas?" she called out as he reached the fence. "Where's the flour?" Their 3 children appeared from various locations. Jacob, 10 years old and tall for his age, had been working in the vegetable garden. Emma, 8, had been playing with their old dog Rusty. Little Sarah, 6 and still fighting that persistent cough, peeked out from the doorway. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. "How did you explain something you barely understood yourself?" "I didn't buy any flour," he said finally. Mary's hands dropped to her sides. The wet shirt she had been hanging fell back into the basket. "You didn't?" "Thomas, what are you saying? Did you lose the money? Were you robbed?" "No. I gave it away." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children seemed to understand that something significant had just happened. Little Sarah's cough punctuated the quiet. "You gave it away," Mary repeated, her voice flat and careful. "You gave away our last dollar. There was a woman in town, an Apache woman. She was starving, Mary. Dying, maybe. She was begging me not to help her because she thought she wasn't worth it." Mary's face went through a complicated series of emotions. Thomas could see her trying to understand, trying to reconcile her husband's soft heart with the hard reality of their situation. She was a good woman, a kind woman, but she was also a mother, with 3 hungry children. "Thomas," she said, and her voice cracked just a little. "We have 3 children. 3 children who need to eat. Little Sarah is sick. We barely have enough to get through winter, as it is. How could you just give away the only money we had?" Jacob spoke up from near the garden. "Pa, did you really give our food money to an Indian?" There was no malice in the boy's voice, just genuine confusion. He had grown up in Dry Creek, had absorbed the town's attitudes without even realizing it. To him, As to most people in town, the Apache were something other, something less than fully human. They were obstacles that had been removed, so that good Christian families could settle the land. Thomas looked at his son, really looked at him, and realized that this was a teaching moment. Maybe the most important teaching moment he would ever have. I gave money to a person who needed it more than we did, Thomas said firmly. And yes, she was Apache. But she was a person first. A person who was hurting. A person who had been told so many times that she didn't matter that she believed it. I gave her that money because it was the right thing to do. And because I want you children to understand something important. He paused, gathering his thoughts, aware that all three children were watching him intently. We're poor, Thomas continued. I won't lie to you about that. We struggle. Sometimes we go hungry. But we're not so poor that we can't afford to be decent human beings. We're not so desperate that we have to turn our backs on suffering. The measure of a person isn't how much money they have or what color their skin is. It's what they do when they have a choice between what's easy and what's right. Mary had tears in her eyes now. She looked at Thomas, at their children, at the empty basket where flowers should have been. What are we going to do? She asked quietly. Thomas didn't have a good answer. He knew that what he had done had consequences, that noble gestures didn't fill empty stomachs. We'll figure it out, he said. We always do. That night, they ate a thin soup made from vegetable scraps and the last of their beans. The children went to bed hungry, though none of them complained. Mary was quiet, not angry exactly, but not forgiving either. She lay beside Thomas in the darkness, and he could feel the weight of her worry pressing down on both of them. I hope she uses it for food, Mary whispered. I hope it wasn't for nothing. It wasn't for nothing, Thomas replied, though he couldn't explain exactly why he was so certain. In the days that followed, words spread through Dry Creek like wildfire. Thomas Walker, the fool who gave his last dollar to a worthless Apache. The story grew with each telling. Some said he had given her $10. Others claimed he had bought her a horse. The facts didn't really matter. What mattered was that Thomas had broken an unspoken rule of their community. He had treated an Apache woman like she was worthy of kindness. The consequences came swiftly. When Thomas went to the mill to ask about temporary work, the foreman suddenly had no positions available. At the general store, the prices seemed to mysteriously increase when Thomas was the customer. Even at church on Sunday, families who had been cordial before now gave him cold shoulders and distant nods. Mrs. Henderson was the worst. She made it her personal mission to ensure everyone knew what Thomas had done, always with that same contemptuous sniff. Gave money to an Indian, she would say, shaking her head. And his own babies going hungry. Some people have no sense at all. The Walker children started hearing things too. At school, other kids whispered and pointed. Someone called Jacob Indian lover and pushed him into the dirt. Emma came home crying one day after being excluded from a game. Little Sarah's cough got worse, but when Mary tried to get credit at the doctor's office, she was turned away. We don't extend credit to people who can't manage their finances, the doctor's wife said primly. Thomas felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had been naive, perhaps. He had thought the cost would be his own hunger, not his children's suffering. Doubt crept in during the long sleepless nights. Had he been selfish, in a way? Had he chosen to feel good about himself at his family's expense? But every time he started to spiral into regret, he remembered Sarah Blackfeather's face. That absolute conviction that she was worthless. And he knew that if he had walked past her, if he had chosen his own comfort over her survival, something essential inside him would have died. Maybe you couldn't always choose between right and wrong. Maybe sometimes you had to choose between two hard things and hope you could live with the consequences. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The Walker family learned to stretch meager supplies even further. They ate wild greens from the fields, the few eggs their chickens produced, and the increasingly creative soups Mary concocted from almost nothing. They were surviving, barely, but surviving nonetheless. Then one evening, just as the sun was setting and Thomas was coming in from repairing a fence, he saw a figure approaching the house. At first, he thought it might be one of the ranch hands from town, maybe bringing news or a job offer. But as the figure got closer, he realized it was a woman. And not just any woman. It was Sarah Blackfeather. She looked different. Cleaner, for one thing. Her hair was combed and braided. Her clothes, while still patched, were neat. But more than that, she carried herself differently. Her shoulders were back, her head was up. She walked with purpose rather than the defeated shuffle he remembered. When she reached the fence, she stopped and looked Thomas directly in the eye. Behind him, he heard Mary come out onto the porch, then the children peering around her skirts. "Mr. Walker," Sarah said, her English clearer and more confident than before. "I came to thank you, and to offer you something in return." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. I'm just glad to see you looking better." Sarah's lips quirked in something that might have been a smile. "That dollar you gave me, I used it to buy food and medicine. Real medicine. For the first time in almost a year, I could think clearly. Could remember who I used to be. Before everything fell apart." She paused, looking at the house, the farm, the family watching from the porch. "I heard what happened to you because of me," she continued. "Heard how the town treats you now. Heard about your children going hungry. I can't give you back that dollar. I spent it like you wanted me to. But I can give you something else." She reached into the bag she was carrying and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Food," she said simply. "I've been working for a rancher 2 towns over. He doesn't care that I'm Apache, just cares that I work hard. I save part of my wages to buy this. Flour, dried meat, some vegetables. It's not everything, but it's something." Thomas stared at the bundle, emotions warring inside him. Pride wanted him to refuse. Practicality demanded he accept. Before he could decide, Mary was there beside him. "Come inside," Mary said firmly. "You'll stay for supper. It won't be much, but you're welcome to share what we have." Sarah looked between them, surprised. "I couldn't impose." "You're not imposing," Mary said, and now there was warmth in her voice. "You're accepting hospitality. There's a difference. Thomas was right to help you. I was angry at first, I won't lie. But seeing you now, seeing that you survived and fought your way back, he was right." That evening, they sat together around the Walkers' simple table. Sarah shared stories of her people, carefully at first, then with growing confidence as she saw the children's fascination rather than disgust. She told them about Apache medicine, about reading the land, about the old ways that were slowly being forgotten. In turn, the Walkers shared their own stories. Jacob talked about school. Emma showed Sarah a drawing she had made. Little Sarah, despite her cough, climbed right up onto Sarah's lap as if she belonged there. And Mary, watching this woman who had once knelt in the dirt begging not to be helped now helping to wash their dishes, felt something shift in her own heart. "I'd like to propose something," Sarah said as the evening drew to a close. "You helped me when I had nothing. Let me help you now. I can work. I'm strong. I know farming, animal care, medicine. Let me stay here and work for you. I don't need wages, just a place to sleep and food to eat. I'll earn my keep." Thomas and Mary exchanged glances. They didn't have much, didn't have a spare room or extra resources, but they had a barn with a loft that could be made comfortable. And God knew they could use the help, especially with the town turning against them. "We can't pay you," Thomas said honestly. "I don't want pay," Sarah replied. "I want to repay a debt. I want to prove that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. And honestly, I have nowhere else to go. The reservations won't take me because I left. The towns won't have me because of who I am. But maybe here, maybe with people who see me as a person first, maybe here I could belong." That night, Sarah Blackfeather moved into the Walker's barn loft. It wasn't much, but it was dry and warm, and it was offered with genuine kindness. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah went to sleep feeling like she had a purpose, like she mattered. And for the Walkers, despite the town's continued shunning, despite the hardships that still lay ahead, they went to sleep knowing they had done something right. Something good. Something that might just make all the difference. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to the Walker farm that felt almost magical. Sarah Blackfeather proved to be everything she had promised and more. She rose before dawn and worked until well after sunset, never complaining, always finding ways to help. But more than just her labor, she brought knowledge. She taught Mary which wild plants could be used for medicine, carefully explaining how to recognize them and prepare them. When little Sarah's cough worsened, It was Sarah who made a tea from roots and herbs that finally brought relief. Within 3 days, the girl was breathing clearly for the first time in weeks. Mary wept with gratitude. She showed Jacob how to track animals, how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of birds. The boy, who had initially been wary, became her devoted shadow, soaking up every lesson. Emma learned how to work with clay from the riverbank, creating simple but sturdy pottery. Even Thomas found himself learning, understanding the land in ways he never had before. But it wasn't easy. The town's hostility didn't fade. If anything, it intensified when word spread that the Apache woman was now living on the Walker farm. Rumors swirled, each more ridiculous than the last. Some said Sarah was Thomas's mistress. Others claimed she was cursing the town with Apache magic. The general store refused to serve them at all now, forcing Thomas to travel to the next town over, adding hours to every supply run. The children's situation at school grew worse. Jacob came home with a black eye one day after defending Sarah's honor. Emma was excluded from every social event. Parents instructed their children not to play with the Walker kids. The teacher, Mrs. Morrison, began marking their assignments more harshly, finding fault where there was none. The pressure built like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Thomas could feel it every time he went to town, in the hostile stares and turned backs. Mary felt it in the isolation, the way women she had considered friends now crossed the street to avoid her. Even little Sarah, young as she was, understood that something was wrong, that they were different now, separate from the community they had once belonged to. It all came to a head on a Sunday morning in late autumn. The Walker family, as was their custom, prepared to attend church. Sarah offered to stay behind, uncomfortable with the idea of attending a Christian service, but also not wanting to cause more trouble for the family who had shown her such kindness. "You should come," Mary said firmly. "God's house is for everyone, no matter what some people might think." So Sarah accompanied them, dressed in her cleanest clothes, her hair braided neatly. The walk to town was tense. Thomas and Mary both knew this might not go well, but they also knew that hiding Sarah away, treating her like something shameful, would be a betrayal of everything they believed in. The reaction when they entered the church was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. The organist actually stopped playing, her fingers frozen on the keys. Mrs. Henderson, seated in the front pew as always, stood up so abruptly her hat fell off. "Reverend Mitchell," she called out, her voice shrill with outrage. "Are we really going to allow this? An Indian? In God's house?" Reverend Mitchell, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and graying hair, looked troubled. He glanced at Sarah, then at Thomas, then at the congregation that was rapidly dividing into camps. Some faces showed open hostility. Others showed mere discomfort. A very few showed something that might have been sympathy. "Mrs. Henderson," the Reverend began carefully, "this is a house of worship. All are welcome here." "Not savages," Mr. Henderson interjected, standing beside his wife. "The Bible says we shouldn't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That woman is a heathen. She has no place here." Thomas felt his face flush with anger. Beside him, Sarah had gone very still, her face carefully blank in that way he had seen before, the way she had looked in that alley when she was trying to disappear. He started to speak, to defend her, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's all right," she whispered. "We can go." "No," Thomas said, his voice ringing out clearly in the silent church. "It's not all right." He stepped forward, moving into the aisle where everyone could see him clearly. His family, his children, and Sarah remained at the back. But Thomas walked right up to where Mrs. Henderson stood. "You want to talk about the Bible?" Thomas said, and there was steel in his voice that his neighbors had never heard before. "Let's talk about the Bible. Let's talk about the Good Samaritan, who helped a stranger when everyone else walked by. Let's talk about Jesus, who ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, who touched lepers, who told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. You know what Jesus said about people who think they're righteous but have no compassion? He called them whitewashed tombs. Pretty on the outside, full of death on the inside." Mrs. Henderson's face turned purple. "How dare you? We are good Christian people." "Are you?" Thomas challenged. "Because I see a woman who is dying in the street, and every single one of you walked past her. I see someone who needed help, and you all decided she wasn't worth your time or your mercy. I see neighbors who have turned their backs on my family because we chose kindness over cruelty. If that's Christianity, then I want no part of it. The church erupted into chaos. People were shouting now, some in agreement with Thomas, more in outrage. The Hendersons were demanding that Thomas be thrown out. Reverend Mitchell was trying to restore order. Through it all, Sarah remained at the back of the church, tears streaming down her face. Then a voice cut through the noise. Enough. It was Dr. Harrison, the town doctor, a man who usually kept himself above the fray of community politics. He stood in his pew, and something in his bearing commanded attention. Slowly, the shouting died down. "I've been sitting here listening to all of you," Dr. Harrison said, his voice heavy with disgust, "listening to you argue about whether a human being deserves basic decency. And I'm ashamed. Ashamed of this town. Ashamed of myself for staying silent." He gestured towards Sarah. "That woman there, she's been living with the Walkers for weeks now. You know what I've heard? That she cured little Sarah Walker's cough when my medicines couldn't. That she's teaching those children skills that might save their lives someday. That she works from dawn to dusk without complaint. But none of that matters to you, does it? Because she's Apache. Because she's different." Dr. Harrison's wife tugged at his sleeve, clearly uncomfortable, but he shook her off. "We took this land," he continued. "We drove out the people who lived here first. We broke every treaty we ever made with them. And now, when one of them needs help, when one of them is literally starving in our streets, we turn away. We congratulate ourselves on our civilization while acting like barbarians." He turned to Thomas. "You did the right thing, Walker. And I should have said so weeks ago instead of watching your family suffer." The silence that followed was different now. Not hostile exactly, but uncertain. Seeds of doubt had been planted. People were looking at each other, at Sarah, at themselves, with new eyes. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. "Fine words," she spat. "But they don't change facts. That woman is dangerous. Her people are dangerous. You're all going to regret this. Mark my words." She swept out of the church, her husband and a few supporters following. About a third of the congregation got up and left as well. But the rest remained, unsure and uncomfortable, but no longer quite so certain in their condemnation. Reverend Mitchell finally stepped forward. "These are difficult times," he said quietly. "We all have much to think about. But let us remember that God asks us to love, not to judge." Church is dismissed. The Walker family left quietly, Sarah walking between them like they were protecting her from a storm. They didn't speak until they were well outside of town, the fields stretching around them familiar and safe. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "I'm so sorry. I've brought nothing but trouble to your family." "You've brought nothing but blessings," Mary said firmly. "Anyone who can't see that is blind." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a strange kind of peace settled over the farm. They had lost something today, the comfort of community acceptance. But they had gained something too, a clarity about who they were and what they stood for. "Pa," Jacob asked, "do you think things will get better?" Thomas looked at his son, at his daughters, at his wife, at Sarah. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know we did the right thing, and sometimes that has to be enough." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of winter. Difficult days were coming. But inside the Walker farmhouse, 5 people sat together in the warmth of shared conviction, and for that moment, it was enough. The winter that followed was the harshest anyone could remember. Snow fell early and heavy, burying the fields and making the roads nearly impassable. The Walker farm, already struggling under the weight of the town's ostracism, faced its greatest test yet. But Sarah's presence proved invaluable. She knew how to preserve food in ways Mary had never learned. She showed them how to insulate the house with mud and grass. When their last chicken stopped laying, Sarah caught fish through holes in the ice of the nearby creek. When Thomas's old injury from years ago flared up in the cold, making it hard for him to work, Sarah taught Mary massage techniques that brought relief. The children thrived despite everything, or perhaps because of everything. Without school to attend, they spent their days learning from Sarah, absorbing knowledge that no classroom could provide. Jacob became skilled at trapping. Emma learned to weave baskets so tight they could hold water. Little Sarah, her cough finally gone, learned songs in the Apache language that made Sarah weep with homesickness and joy. But isolation took its toll. Mary grew quieter as the weeks passed, the weight of being cut off from other women, other adults, pressing down on her. Thomas wore himself ragged trying to be farmer, hunter, and provider all at once. And Sarah, despite her outward strength, sometimes woke in the night from dreams of her childhood, of her family, of the life that had been taken from her. Then, in the depth of winter, disaster struck the town. It started with a fever. A traveling merchant came through, selling goods door to door. Within a week, a quarter of the town was sick. Within 2 weeks, it was half. The fever burned hot and fast, leaving people delirious and weak. Children were especially vulnerable. The town doctor, Dr. Harrison, worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep up, but his medicines seemed to have little effect. The Walkers heard about it from a boy who had been sent running to every farm in the area begging for help. The town needed supplies, needed hands, needed anything and everything. The boy barely glanced at Sarah, too focused on his desperate message to care who was listening. Thomas looked at Mary. Mary looked at Sarah. They all knew what the question was without anyone having to ask it. Should they help? Should they come to the aid of a town that had shunned them, that had made their lives miserable, that had treated Sarah like she was less than human? Sarah spoke first. "I know this fever," she said quietly. "We called it the burning sickness. It came through my people's camp when I was young. Many died, but some survived. The ones who survived had help from our healers." "Do you know how to treat it?" Mary asked. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes. There's a root that grows near water. It's rare, and you have to know exactly how to prepare it. Too much, and it's poison. Too little, and it does nothing. But the right amount can break the fever. I watched my grandmother use it to save my brother's life." Thomas felt his heart racing. This was it. This was the moment. They could stay here, safe on their farm, and let the town reap what it had sown. Or they could be better than the town had been to them. "Can you gather enough of this root to help them?" he asked Sarah. "Maybe," Sarah said, "if I can find it. If the creeks aren't frozen solid. If I remember correctly how to identify it. It's been many years." "Then we should try," Thomas said simply. "Thomas," Mary said, her voice low and urgent, "they'll probably refuse help from us." "From her. You know they will." "Then that's their choice," Thomas replied. "But we have to offer." So they set out before dawn the next morning, all 5 of them. Sarah led the way to the creek, then to spots she remembered from her childhood, places where certain plants grew. The ground was frozen, the searching was hard, but Sarah was determined. After hours of careful hunting, she had gathered a small basket of roots. Back at the farm, Sarah worked through the night, preparing the medicine exactly as her grandmother had taught her. She ground the roots, mixed them with specific proportions of water, boiled them in a careful rhythm. The smell filled the house, bitter and earthy. By morning, she had prepared enough medicine for perhaps 20 doses. It wasn't much, but it was something. When they arrived in town, pulling a small wagon loaded with the medicine, food supplies, and clean linens, the reaction was mixed. Some people were too sick to care who was helping. Others turned away in stubborn pride. Mrs. Henderson, feverish and weak, actually spat at them from her bed. But Dr. Harrison, exhausted and desperate, took one look at what Sarah had brought and nearly collapsed with relief. "What is it?" he asked. Sarah explained, carefully and thoroughly. Dr. Harrison listened, then nodded slowly. "Nothing I have has worked. At this point, I'll try anything, but I need your help. I need you to show me how to administer it, how much to give, what to watch for." For the next 3 days, Sarah worked alongside Dr. Harrison. She showed him which patients were most critical, taught him the signs to watch for, explained the balance between too much and too little. Thomas and Mary worked tirelessly as well, bringing water, changing linens, sitting with the dying. And slowly, miraculously, people began to recover. The fever broke, color returned to gray faces. Children who had been at death's door began to sit up, to take food, to cry for their mothers again. Mrs. Henderson recovered too, though she never thanked Sarah directly. But Thomas noticed that she didn't hurl any more insults either. She just lay there, watching Sarah work. something complicated working its way across her face. It took a week for the worst of the crisis to pass. In the end, 3 people had died, but dozens had been saved. Dozens who almost certainly would have perished without Sarah's knowledge. When it was over, when the last patient was out of danger, a strange thing happened. The town gathered in the square, weak and tired but alive. Dr. Harrison stood in the center, and he called for Sarah to join him. She came reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. But Dr. Harrison took her hand and raised it high. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing out clearly, "saved this town. Not me. My medicine did nothing. But her knowledge, her skills, the traditions of her people that we've spent so long dismissing as superstition, they saved us. And we owe her more than we can ever repay." There was silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone began to clap. Then another. Then another. Within moments, the entire town was applauding. Not everyone, true. Some stood with arms crossed, still resistant. But more than half, probably 2/3 of the town, were clapping for Sarah Blackfeather. Tears streamed down her face. These were the same people who had walked past her in the street, who had treated her like garbage, who had made Thomas and his family suffer for showing her kindness. And now they were applauding her. Reverend Mitchell stepped forward. "I think we all owe someone else an apology too," he said. "Thomas Walker and his family. They saw what we refused to see. They did what we refused to do. And we made them pay for it. Thomas, Mary, children, I am deeply sorry. And I hope the rest of you will join me in making amends." What followed was a slow, awkward, but genuine transformation. People came to Thomas, one by one, to apologize. Some brought gifts, small tokens to make up for the hardships they had caused. The general store extended credit. The mill offered work. The school teacher sent word that the Walker children were welcome back, and that their past assignments would be regraded fairly. Mrs. Henderson was one of the last to approach. She stood before Sarah for a long moment, struggling with herself. Finally, she spoke. "I was wrong," she said stiffly. "About you, about what you deserved. You saved my life, and I treated you worse than an animal. I am sorry." Sarah looked at the older woman, seeing not an enemy but a person struggling with beliefs she had held her whole life. "I forgive you," Sarah said simply. "We all do what we think is right. Sometimes we're wrong. What matters is if we can learn." As the sun set that evening, the Walker family and Sarah sat on the porch of their farmhouse, looking out over the fields. They were exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but there was peace too. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Will everything be better?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Some things will be better," he said. "Some people learn something important, but not everyone will change. Some folks, they'll go right back to how they were. Change is slow and hard, but we made a difference. We proved that doing the right thing matters, even when it costs you." "Are you staying?" little Sarah asked, looking up at Sarah Blackfeather. Sarah smiled, the first truly joyful smile Thomas had ever seen on her face. "If you'll have me," she said. "I think I've finally found a home." Mary reached over and took Sarah's hand. "You're family now," she said firmly. "For as long as you want to be." In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. Sarah became a respected member of the community, sought after for her medical knowledge and her skills. Dr. Harrison convinced her to teach him everything she knew, creating a blend of Western and Apache medicine that served the town well for years to come. The Walker farm prospered. With Sarah's help, they learned sustainable farming techniques that made their land more productive. With the town's renewed support, they were able to expand, to build, to thrive. The children grew up with an understanding of the world that few of their peers had. They learned that people were people, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. They learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant standing alone. And they learned that one small act of kindness, one silver dollar given to a desperate stranger, could change everything. Thomas Walker lived to be an old man. When he died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, the entire town turned out for his funeral. Sarah Blackfeather stood at the front, gray-haired now but still strong, and she spoke of the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had valued her when she valued herself at nothing. "He gave me $1, she said simply. But what he really gave me was the belief that I was worth something, that my life mattered, that my people's knowledge had value, that I deserved kindness. $1. One moment of compassion in a hard world, and it changed everything." Years later, when Sarah herself passed, surrounded by the children and grandchildren who had loved her, they buried her next to Thomas in the town cemetery. On her gravestone, they carved a simple inscription, Sarah Blackfeather. Healer, teacher, friend. She taught us that wisdom knows no borders, and kindness costs nothing but means everything. The story of Thomas Walker and Sarah Blackfeather became legend in that part of the country. Parents told it to their children. Teachers taught it in schools. And whenever someone wondered if one person could make a difference, if one act of kindness mattered in a cruel world, they remembered. They remembered a poor farmer who gave his last dollar to a desperate woman. They remembered a community that learned, slowly and painfully, that worth isn't determined by race or status. They remembered that sometimes the greatest treasures look like nothing at all. Just a silver coin pressed into a trembling hand. Just a moment of recognition between two suffering souls. And they remembered that in that moment, in that choice, everything changed. Not just for two people, but for a whole community. Not just for one generation, but for all the ones that followed. Because that's the thing about kindness. It ripples outward, it compounds, it grows. What seemed like nothing, $1 from a man who had nothing to give, became everything. A life saved, a family built, a town transformed, a legacy that would never be forgotten. In the end, that's what matters. Not how much we have, but what we do with it. Not whether we're rich or poor, powerful or weak, but whether we choose compassion when it would be easier to choose indifference. Not whether we can solve every problem, but whether we're willing to solve the one right in front of us. Thomas Walker understood that. Sarah Blackfeather understood that. And because they did, because they acted on that understanding, even when it cost them everything, they changed the world. Maybe not the whole world. Just their corner of it, just their town, their community, their moment in time. But isn't that how all great change begins? Not with grand gestures or massive movements, but with one person seeing another person suffering and deciding that they cannot, will not, walk away. With one act of unlikely, illogical, beautiful kindness. With one silver dollar pressed into desperate hands, and the simple, radical belief that every human life has worth. That was Thomas Walker's gift to Sarah Blackfeather. And in the end, it was their shared gift to everyone who came after. The reminder that we are not powerless, that we can make a difference, that sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest ripples, that sometimes $1 is enough to change the world.